Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and we're back this time talking about the cantrip changes in the new remaster. Now, obviously, this is only covering cantrips that were found in both the core book or the advanced player's guide, which I don't know if there were any in the advanced player's guide, maybe one or two. In any regard, so any cantrips that were, done in Secrets of Magic, for instance, or Rage of Elements, will not receive changes right away, but they'll be doing an errata for a lot of the books further down the line. So, that being the case, these changes are predominantly for new players coming to the game, obviously. But if you don't like any of the changes to the cantrips, you can still use old versions of cantrips if that's what you really want to do. Paizo has gone on to say before that any changes they make in the remaster are completely compatible with the initial release for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So, that being the case, if you don't like a change, don't use it. It's as simple as that. It will still be found on Archive and Nethys, so Archive and Nethys will have an old version and a new version, so you can see the changes as you are. And as well, I guess I should mention, Paizo did provide to me the player core and the GM core so that I could review it as one of the reviewers, but this is not sponsored content. So all thoughts and ideas about the cantrips are my own. So you can't blame Paizo for them other than the fact that they were changed in the first place. That being the case, let's go ahead and get into the changes. And honestly, starting off, I didn't find many changes, to be honest. I mean, many of the cantrips did get touched up on maybe a little bit, but for the most part, they work the same. And some of them even got buffs. Caustic Blast, for instance, which used to be Acid Splash, is, in my opinion, much better. Now, you can complain about the difference because now I believe, let's see, what was it before? Oh, it actually didn't even get a damage nerf. It actually got a damage buff. It's now a D8 rather than a D6, though the biggest difference is it now no longer does splash. Instead, it has an area of a 5-foot burst, and it's no longer an attack cantrip, instead just relying on a basic reflex saving throw from the enemy. Now, as before on a what was before a critical success on the attack roll, now a critical failure on the reflex save, they still get that persistent acid damage, and it heightens at the same rate of every odd spell rank up, and it increases by an additional D8, which is pretty huge, plus the persistent damage going up. Now, overall, looking at the old versus the new, I think there is a little bit of a damage fall off, but I think Caustic Blast actually does more damage because it's now just an area spell. So now, rather than a bunch of nearby enemies getting the splash damage, you're just hitting more enemies with the blast, making Caustic Blast probably one of the better damage cantrips in the game at the moment, as its damage potential is actually really good. And honestly, Acid Splash before was always very infuriating to use because you always wanted to use it when an ally was attacking an enemy, and so that ally would just have to take some splash damage or you've negated it in some form or fashion. Now you can just position the blast outside of it, so even if you're going single target with Caustic Blast, which is still not a bad idea, honestly, you don't have to worry about that splash hitting your allies. So overall, I think Caustic Blast is an overall buff to what was Acid Splash. And of course, it won't be one of my videos unless I forgot to move my camera again. But hey, I've moved it now so you can see my face. So, next up is Daze. Daze was a little disappointing overall. So, Daze was reworked a little bit, and I don't know. Because if you were to look at the tag here, it says, cloud a creature's mind to make it off guard or slow. Now, when you look at Daze, it does neither of those things. Slow, arguably, because, stunned 1 potentially is the same as slowed 1. But there's nothing about off guard here. Now it just does a D6 mental damage on a basic will save. Everything else the same. It just no longer... before it was just your spellcasting modifier, and then it got D6s. So a little bit of a damage nerf. And I feel like they wanted it to be off guard if the enemy failed, which would have been better, in my opinion. But that's not what we have here. And so the little tag doesn't make really any sense. I don't know. And actually, before I even continue, I want to say, like, Paizo's reasons. Now, this is not anything I necessarily agree with, but Paizo's reasons for the cantrip changes is to make them more in line with other spells, because most other spells did not use your spellcasting modifier, so this just streamlined it a little bit. It was also one of the reasons why Caustic Blast got changed, because it was like one of the very few spells that actually did splash damage, and now it just is an area attack, which I think is honestly better. So I think that's a good change. And more or less, like, the biggest reason I think they wanted to change how cantrips worked is because monsters did way more damage with cantrips than players did, and cantrips always felt bad for non-casters to utilize. And that's the thing, is that cantrips were kind of more of a like providing a range option or something, and so even though you were less accurate or your spells weren't as effective, it was just something that felt bad for some people. And so they wanted to make it where if you're multi-classing or you have an ancestry that comes with innate spellcasting, your cantrips are a bit more appealing. Now, this is not anything I necessarily agree with. That is their reasons. Days here just feels more like a nerf in general, and nothing really changed worthwhile to make up the difference. Now, if they came out and said, if it hits, the enemy is also off guard to then, even if it's just the next attack it receives, I would be happy. Honestly, I think that would be a really good improvement for Days. But as it stands now, it just, rather than doing your spellcasting modifier and damage, it just does a d6 mental damage. So yeah, if they crit fail or stunned one, which rarely happens, but could. I don't know. I feel like after reading the tag and then looking at Days, I'm just overall disappointed, because I felt like Days was going to actually do something interesting, but who knows. Anyway, that is what changed with Days anyway. Detect Magic has been slightly altered, and this is just a very common thing because there's no longer spell schools. You can see here in the heightened version of the spell, it no longer detects the spell school of the magic effect. All it does now is it detects the spell level or the spell rank or spell magic effect level if it's not a spell within its range. So, I mean, it's one of those things with the spell schools thing that one of my disagreements with the change, because now things like detect magic just say, hey, there's magic nearby, it's kind of powerful, and that's it, which I feel is kind of bad. I liked, even if it was just a small hint, even if it didn't make a ton of sense, at least gave players somewhat of an idea of what was coming. So who knows? Obviously, I could use the old changes, and maybe I will to some degree. But yeah, that was the only change to detect magic. Electric Arc got the damage treatment. It now does 2d4 electricity damage rather than a d4 plus spellcasting modifier, and it heightens at relatively the same rate. Overall, honestly, I'm not too disappointed by this one. Electric Arc always kind of reigns supreme on the battlefield in general, and even now, it's still probably going to do really well. I will say that probably Caustic Blast now has more of a place because it has much better damage potential than Electric Arc does if two enemies are close enough to each other anyway. But Electric Arc being knocked down a peg, I think, was just something that was necessary. So yeah, I mean, and again, the damage isn't going to be that much. Like on average, 2 damage difference. So who knows? In any regard, Electric Arc now does not add your spellcasting modifier, and instead it just does 2d4 damage. Now, here's a change I'm actually super stoked for, because Ghost Sound was interesting, but it always felt very difficult to use in some situation. Now we have Figment, which is more than just auditory. You create a simple sound or vision. The sound adds the auditory trait to the spell, and the sound can't include intelligible words or elaborate music. And a vision adds the visual trait and can not be larger than a 5-foot cube, and is clearly crude and undetailed if viewed within 15 feet. Now, when you cast a spell, you can attempt a create a diversion with the illusion, gaining a +2 circumstance bonus to your deception check. If the attempt fails against a creature, that creature disbelieves the figment. I actually really like this change. It was something that I felt like what Ghost Sound was always best for. And now, this being the case, I think it works a lot better. Plus, the circumstance bonus to the deception check is really good. And now it's a lot more versatile. So overall, honestly, Ghost Sound, now Figment, getting pretty big buff. All right, here's an interesting change. Ray of Frost got essentially changed to Frostbite. It lost a good amount of its range, but there's an error here of Frostbite because Frostbite is not a spell attack, so I don't know why it has the attack trait. Now, it's just a Fortitude save, and the damage is 2d4 cold damage with a basic Fortitude rather than just d4 plus spellcasting modifier, so same as many other spells. Now, on a crit failure, this is actually really cool. And now the target also gains weakness 1 to bludgeoning until the start of your turn. Ray of Frost just made it a -10 to its status to its speed for 1 round. So honestly, I like this crit effect better, or this crit fail effect better, I guess, as it just seems like you'll get more out of it. Before, like, the status penalty to speed might have helped, or the enemy was close enough that it didn't matter anyway. And so it just kind of felt bad, even though they crit failed your spell. I mean, obviously taking more damage, but still, you critically hit them with your spell. Now, it feels like the effect is a lot more worthwhile. And as it heightens, the weakness increases, where before the speed penalty didn't increase, which would have been ridiculous anyway. So overall, I actually really like this change to Ray of Frost, now Frostbite. And, I think it works better. I think they just need to remove the attack trait here because it does not belong, since the spell no longer requires an attack roll. Gouging Claw also got the damage change. It now does 2d6 slashing damage or 2d6 piercing damage rather than the d6 plus spellcasting modifier. And now it does 2 persistent bleed damage rather than doing, what was it, a d4 persistent bleed on crit. And now when you crit with Gouging Claw, not only do you do double the damage, you also double the bleed damage it dealt. Now, that does cap its persistent bleed damage potential on crit, technically. Oh, no. Actually, it makes it better. So, yeah, overall, Gouging Claw, honestly, in my opinion, getting a damage buff, as even though it is losing your persistent spellcasting modifier, the 2 persistent bleed damage most of the time is just going to make up the difference anyway. And getting persistent bleed on a melee hit from a caster is really good. This is honestly not a bad pickup, even for non-casters, just to get a reliable source of persistent bleed on the enemy. But yeah, overall, I think Gouging Claw is really good. All right, here's a change many of you are already familiar with. Produce Flame got changed to Ignition. It now has a melee form, and as well, it rather than doing the d4 plus spellcasting modifier, it just does 2d4 fire damage on hit. Now, if the target is within your melee reach, you can choose to make it a melee spell attack instead, which increases the damage to d6s. Overall, I believe just improving Ignition's, or what was Produce Flame's damage potential, and as well, it gives a very solid melee option, which I think Magus is really going to enjoy, something that I think they're really gonna utilize with it if they're not spell striking with it. But even if they are spell striking with it, I guess technically that it would just do more damage automatically. So yeah, really cool. Plus still does the persistent fire on crit. So overall, I think Ignition is a really good change and probably one of my favorite cantrip changes to the remaster. Know the Way did get actually a bit of a buff. Now no longer is it only do you detect true north, but you can also choose a location you were at within the last 24 hours and learn the direction it lies from your current position. This was something that you could only really get at level 7, or the 7th height rank version of it before. And now the 7th rank version is improves it so that it can be anywhere that you were, as long as you were on the same plane. So it's overall pretty good. Know the Way, I think, generally works better. Knowing where you were in the last 24 hours is pretty huge when it comes to, orientation and direction. just north might not have been helpful, especially if you didn't have a map to really like utilize with it. So knowing the direction of north and your last location can give you a good amount of information. So I think Know the Way getting this buff is actually pretty big. Light got a buff, and this is a very strange one to say it got a buff because, you know, it really wasn't anything that you could buff before, but I actually like it way better now. Now, before you had to make an object like illuminate to use it essentially as a torch, but now you just create a ball of light, and that you can choose to attach that ball of light to a person, causing that the light to move with them. So rather than having like an illuminated or like weapon or something, you now just have a ball of light following you. I like the design and the fantasy of this a lot more. In my opinion, it seems to work a lot better. And as well, I think there's a lot of situations where this could get very strange. Is like, okay, but what if they sheath the weapon, right? Then does the light go out? I think that causes a lot of confusion. So overall, I think this is a pretty big change to light. And moving it is even better now, because now you can just sustain the spell to move it up to 60 feet or attach it to another creature as a part of the movement. So before you had to like essentially recast it to get that distance. And now it can be done at a range of 120 feet. So overall, light, huge buff, a lot better for actually lighting things up. And this does remind me, dancing lights was actually removed. So I think this is kind of, they just combine both of these lighting cantrips together to make a better lighting cantrip, especially the heightened version of light, which I don't think it had a heightened version before. Oh, it did have a heightened version before, but yeah, once you heightened it, you wouldn't have even needed dancing lights anyway, as a 60-foot radius is pretty huge. So that being the case, I actually really like this change of light, and light is now, in my eyes anyway, a much better cantrip. Now, this is a pretty big change that I think a lot of people were looking for. Message now just is better. It now has the subtle trait. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the subtle trait, as you didn't watch some of my other videos, then the subtle trait essentially removes the need to incantate out loud the spell's use, which was always a strange thing about the message cantrip, is it had the verbal tag. And in the game, it says if it has a verbal tag, then it must speak in a strong voice, even though the spell states that you mouth the words quietly into someone's ear. It's always very strange and somewhat confusing. Now, message just works even in close proximity, as it doesn't even require the manipulate. Yeah, it doesn't have the manipulate trait, so you can just silently mouth into like what you're saying to someone else, and they can hear you. So I think that message got a big buff from this and is now much easier to use thanks to the subtle trait, which is something I highly appreciate. Read Aura actually got some changes that I think is really good and makes a lot more sense for it. Though similarly to Detect Magic, it no longer can possibly detect the School of Magic since no such thing exists. Now, instead, all it does is you can identify whether the item is magical that you're currently looking at, and you or anyone you advise who's currently studying the object can get a +2 circumstance bonus to identify magic on the item. If the object is illusory, yada yada, all the same stuff, and nothing else really changed other than now you can do it on multiple objects, which I think you could do before. I'm not even going to look at this point. Yeah, so Read Aura, I like the bonus to circumstance. I think this makes it much different than Detect Magic, and much like it'd be a reason why you would take it instead of Detect Magic if that was the thing you were doing, or Detect Magic if you were just more about finding magical items. So I like the change overall, but again, I just don't like the removal of spell school stuff, because now it's like, what can you detect other than the fact that's magical? It's like, well, you probably already knew that. I don't know. That's my gripe. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just voicing my opinion here. That's one of the reasons why I'm making the video in the first place. Regardless, this is the change to Read Aura. All right, so now we are mostly through the video, but before we get to the end, I did want to state that if you guys are enjoying this content, please at least like it to give other people a chance to see it, or subscribe to see a higher chance of getting my content later on your feeds, as I'm doing a lot of stuff for the remaster more than anyone else. And as well, we're at nearly 4,000 subs, which is huge. We just need a little bit more. So if you could help out with that, I'd very much appreciate it. Anyway, enough of the plugs. Let's go ahead and talk about Mage Hand got changed to Telekinetic Hand. It does the same stuff. Nothing really changed about the spell overall. Just a name change, but it's there. So that's cool. Another name change is Tanglefoot is now Tanglevine. Similar reasons. The Tangle, like Mage Hand and Tanglefoot were big D&D pull-offs, so now their names have just been changed for the sake of keeping things different from the OGL license, but nothing actually changed with how Tanglevine works. Telekinetic Projectile got the damage changes that most other ones did. Now it just does 2d6 bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, depending on the objects. And yeah, nothing else. It just got a damage change, which some of you hate, some of you don't care. It is what it is. I'm just telling you what has changed. So yeah, that's what happened with Telekinetic Projectile. All right, Disrupt Undead essentially got changed to Vitality Lash, but now it's been reworked a little bit. Now it just does 2d6 vitality damage with the basic fort saving throw, and if the creature critically fails, it becomes enfeebled 1 until the start of your next turn. This is overall really good, and this one actually pairs up with Void Wrap, which essentially does the same thing, but to living creatures. So these both really make sense, especially with the damage changes. Oh, I missed one earlier. Oh my goodness. Well, since we're talking about these anyway, let's talk about Divine Lance. So Divine Lance got a really huge buff. Divine Lance was always one of the biggest disappointments when it came to being a divine spellcaster, because it was just something that felt like it didn't come into effect that often. You had to go up against pure evil to really get a benefit from it. Divine Lance now just does spirit damage, which means it works on any creature or thing that has a soul, which is pretty cool. So yeah, and it got the same damage changes as many of the other ones did, doing 2d4 spirit damage, doubling on crit. And this one can be sanctified to get either the holy or unholy trait if your character has, one of those traits. So that being the case, I actually really love the change to Divine Lance, and as well, Void Wrap and Vitality Lash being pretty solid additions to do additional damage. These can't heal. There's a lot of people who are confused, like Vitality. Vitality doesn't translate to healing. Vitality is a energy type that can heal if it's done so. But with the heal spell, it doesn't say your character takes vitality damage, does it? It says your character is healed. So yeah, that is the general case. But I do like a lot of these changes, and they're all divine cantrips, especially, which I think makes divine spellcasting feel a lot better since they have much better cantrips now. Speaking on some of those changes, Chill Touch was removed. It's essentially now done through a combination of either Void Wrap or Vitality Lash. So yeah, no more Chill Touch, but Chill Touch was always a very strange one anyway. So I think overall we're much better off with the new cantrips we got out of it. And yeah, that is all the changes. Honestly, not as much as I was expecting. Now, I know this is going to be a bit of a controversial video, and I just want to state that I generally am on the side of people who want to use either side, right? If you preferred how the damage was, the damage minimum was before for a lot of these spells, use the old ones. I think that's completely fine, and I don't think that honestly changes the balance of the game all that much. If you like the new changes, though, I think that's cool as well. As honestly, if you're a true spellcaster, cantrips start falling off as a main damage source pretty fast. And the new changes make being a non-caster using cantrips feel better in general, which I think is a good thing. But I sympathize with those who are missing that minimum damage. And again, and this is something that people have mentioned before, the new changes does make early level casting somewhat harder, which I think is a very fair thing to say. I think if you go with the old rules, it's completely fine. And if you go with the new rules, I think it's completely fine as well. I'll personally be using the new rules, as I think generally it provides buffs for the most part, especially Caustic Blast. And as well, Electric Arc needed to be taken down a peg anyway. So, I'm very much on the side of the new changes. But as I said, I very much sympathize for people who feel like their damage is just being shorted for no reason. As for some of the cantrips, like Daze, for instance, nothing was added to change it. Now, I think Daze is going to get a errata from this because it doesn't match the tag it was mentioned in. And overall, even though you can see that it got some changes, it just feels bad. Honestly, it just doesn't feel like it adds anything. It even do the thing that most other cantrips did, which getting 2 dice. Because I would have been happy with the 2d6 days, but we didn't get that. Instead, we just got a days that just did less damage. That's it. Like, I don't know. I don't know. Just my opinions, though. Anyway, I'm sure you're all gonna let me know your opinions down in the comments, and I'm ready for it, honestly. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Tomorrow we're gonna be taking a look at. However, I don't know exactly how I'm gonna do it yet, but I'm gonna be looking at each of the spell ranks and listing out the changes. So it's either gonna be spell rank by spell rank, or it's gonna be multiple spell ranks if there's not many changes. Paizo said that there wasn't many changes to the spells, except for like name changes. But so I'm gonna judge. You guys will know by tomorrow. But there'll be more videos this week of these spell changes. So if you want to see any of that, I recommend subscribing. And as well, good luck with your games and leave the bad luck to me. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Bye.